name's Tom, as Peter's mentioned, and I'm currently based in West Cork. So my wife Grace and my son Perrin, we live in West Cork. We've just recently moved, and we've moved to work with a new church plant in Skibbereen called Amazing Grace Community Church. So we're excited to have joined just the end of last year. I work part-time for Amazon, and I'm a part-time associate pastor. So we've recently joined ECM to make some of this happen. So we're working with European Christian Mission, which we're delighted. Nice to see you there, Colin, on the call as well. We're delighted to be with ECM just to make all of this happen. That's our day-to-day, working with Amazon and working with the church in Skibbereen with ECM. And part of what we've been doing the last couple of months is putting together this Bible study resource. So we've been very excited to do it, just to give some credit as well. So it's been myself and Grace, my wife, and Paul and Isabel Quinlan who've been writing these Bible studies. Now we've refrained from calling them Bible studies to try to not be too stereotypical. We've been calling them story guides. I think in keeping with the theme of what's the story, we've been calling them story guides to maybe get outside of that idea that we're just sitting down to do just another Bible study with people, but we want people to experience the story of Jesus. The way that we've decided to do that is by answering the 6 key what's the story questions with 6 story guides, or you can say Bible studies if you're not sure what story guides are, which are based around 6 encounters with Jesus in the Gospel of John. So if I can share my screen for a second, I have a document which we're very excited to present. It's going to print very, very soon. And big credit to Pader Drynan, who has done design and putting together of how this looks. We're working with Biblica to get this printed and published. So we're presenting it as a Gospel of John, where the 6 story guides are included within the Gospel. And again, in keeping with the theme, we're calling it What's the Story, John? So it's a great resource. I'll just share the screen. Hopefully this should come up now. So you should be able to see my screen. This is our front cover here. What's the story, John? We're really trying to connect, draw people into that story of the gospel, which is telling the story of Jesus. Now, a note in terms of the studies themselves, they might feel a little different from just a normal Bible study. They're not comprehensive in terms of trying to examine every detail of the chosen text, but they're helping people to experience the story to encounter Jesus. So the idea is to take people on a journey, designed so that they'll feel some movement through the story. So like every story has a beginning, a middle, a climax, and a resolution. We try to bring some of that movement into the Bible study. So just in a moment, I'll try and give you a flavor of that with a Bible study that I'll walk you through, just so you can get an idea of what we're thinking. So it's designed to feel the weight of the questions at the beginning. We're trying to draw people into the story with experiences they're familiar with, and then feel that movement as we work through the questions and moving that perspective towards Jesus and encountering Jesus, and then encouraging people to respond as they've experienced this particular story, which we're trying to use to answer the question in mind. So I'm going to scroll down so that you can see this. You should be able to see what looks like an introductory page, where we have a green on the left and a white with a graphic on the right. So our introduction really is to give an idea of what we will be trying to do with this resource. As I said, it's a full Gospel of John, so we'll have the Gospel of John there, NIV. So we're working with Biblica, who are helping us to get this published and printed. So it'll be the NIV text. But the way that we're trying to use the study is here with this graphic. So there's really 3 sections to each study. There's 6 studies. The first part is there'll be questions or comments or quotes in the connect to the story section, where we're trying to use aspects of Irish life, Irish culture. It could be contemporary culture. It could be past culture. We're going back in one study as far as St. Patrick, and there's one study which refers to contemporary Irish musicians. So we're trying to keep it broad in relating to people where people are at And then we move into the experiencing the story, where we're trying to connect some of the themes introduced in the connect to the story, to dig into the passage itself, to try to get some idea of what the passage is doing, what's happening. And then after the experience in the story, we're hoping that they will encounter Jesus, that they will come to see Jesus in some way, in some fresh way. And then the final section is to respond to the story, where there'll be questions or quotes or comments, where we'll be encouraging people to reflect or to think or to act in some way in response to the themes that we've introduced, but mostly in response to how they've encountered Jesus and how they've seen him throughout the story. So this is a little bit of what it looks like. As you can see, there's the first Bible study based in John chapter 1. I'll just give you a second. I was going to highlight a later study, but if you want to have a look at that for a second, we have, and in case you're wondering, it's a landscape gospel. So it isn't a standard portrait version of the gospel, it's actually landscape. So it's designed, this graphic you can see continues through. So we've used this idea of this line where we're connecting, coming up to the climax. Every story has movement, and the climax really of our stories are to encounter Jesus and coming through that into some sort of response or resolution for the reader. The idea with the Gospel of John here is that we would encourage the use of it with somebody who is a Christian, doing it with somebody who's not a Christian. Now, it may work in Christian groups, that's fine. It's not intended as something to simply be handed, although that can be done. But I think the emphasis or the intention is that this would be done with somebody who's not yet a Christian. So you can see the graphic. We have the connect to the story, up through experience the story, and then respond to the story. And you can see it's in text. So the gospel text will be in line. So that's very standard for NIV here. And I just want to highlight one of them to give you a flavor of what what's the story John will look like. So I'm going to bring you down to this one. So hopefully, again, you can still see. I'll see if I can make it a little bit bigger. So if you can't see it, please start frantically waving and I'll try and change something. But if you're not doing that, I'll just keep going. So we'll have a quick look through this one to give you a flavor of what it looks like. I'll scroll up. So this one is based in John chapter 19, verse 1 to 18. So it's the crucifixion of Jesus. So it's answering the question, can we make sense of our suffering? So that was one of the what's the story questions that was highlighted as one of the key questions through research that is needing to be answered in Irish culture today. And we selected this passage, John 19, verse 1 to 18 and 28 to 37. And the title you can see there is The Cross of Hope. So really the question that we're trying to answer is, can we make sense of our suffering? But as we'll find in the Gospel of John, we've used passages and we didn't want to impose our thinking with this question onto a text. We wanted to let the text speak and try to answer the question. So rather than using the question to shape our thinking, we try to let the text shape our thinking and then write these questions in response to the text, which we believe is how we can help make sense of suffering. So, for example, there's different elements on the page which you can see. In this one, we have a time travel box to try to give a little bit of context to people who may not be familiar with the Bible or Christianity. I'll read that there for you. So it's in the ancient world, crucifixion was considered the most terrible of punishments. It was associated with great shame. It was so brutal that Roman citizens could not be crucified without the sanction of the emperor. The horrors of the cross were reserved for the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low, stripped naked and beaten to pulpy weakness. The victim could hang in the hot sun for hours, even days. Crucifixion prolonged life and agony. It partially supported the body's weight and therefore encouraged the victim to fight on. So this is that was a Carson quote, trying to give a little bit of context as we move to look at the cross so that people would understand a little bit better of what this crucifixion was like. Over to the right, we have a box which is referencing Isaiah. Part of the question, we have a reference to Isaiah in Experience the Story in this section. So we have a quote there, since we don't have the whole Bible in front of us in this gospel. And the way that we've tried to connect to Irish culture in this way was using a poem called Quarantine by Evan Boland. A little bit ironic that we are much more familiar with quarantine than we'd like to be, but that's the title of this poem. And we've used that to try to connect. So I'll read the poem. And again, Peter, start jumping in or shouting at me if I'm going on too long. I'll read the poem briefly and then try to walk through some of the questions to give a flavor of what it might feel like. So you get a sense of what we were trying to do. And then I'll look at the passage. Really, the connect to the story part doesn't really jump into the text yet. We would encourage you to read the passage before starting into the study, just so that it's in your mind. But really the connect to the story is trying to introduce themes with the reader, with the Bible study participant, so that they would be engaged and brought in to the story. So the poem Quarantine by Evan Boland. In the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking, they were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that west and north, until at nightfall under freezing stars they arrived. In the morning they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and a woman, and in which darkness can best be proved. So then we would move to the connect to the story. Again, reading the entire passage, we would encourage. So John 19, 1 to 18. I won't read the entire passage just now, just for the sake of time, but it's the passage where Jesus is brought before Pilate, he's sentenced, and he's crucified. And having that in our minds would be particularly helpful as we come into the connect and into the experience. So suffering is a universal and an unavoidable part of life. What helps you to keep going as you experience suffering? So we're trying to introduce themes that may have been picked up through this poem, and also themes that we're going to experience in the text, but also trying to draw together with the question of suffering here in this part. The second question, Irish history is permeated with the experience of suffering. This is reflected in our literature, poetry, and song. Take a moment to read Evan Boland's poem Quarantine. In the midst of the immense suffering of the husband and wife in this poem, what is clear about the depth of their relationship? So again, this is just trying to ask the participant to engage, looking at a text which they may or may not be familiar with, and to take a couple of thoughts from it. And really it's to highlight the love shared between the husband and wife here. And as we consider the suffering of Jesus in this story, we will see how his love shines all the brighter as he resolutely faces the cross. So we're introducing the idea of the love of Jesus as he faces the cross, in which the love between this husband and wife was proved in the midst of darkness, that the love of Jesus is shown to us in the midst of the darkness of the cross. So as we move then, hopefully we'll have read the text. We'll have maybe if you had any questions or comments, you can do that as you see fit. But the first question in Experience the Story: in the face of hostile opposition, Jesus doesn't seem to defend himself. Why do you think this is? Who does he say is really in control of the situation? We're really trying to get into the text, trying to get the participant to look at what the text says and to draw from that some conclusions. Again, question 2, Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd as their king, beaten, bloody, and bruised. How do they respond, and what is the outcome? Again, we're trying to experience the story in which Jesus is sentenced, how he's tried, and how he's brought out for execution. The third question is less of a draw from the text, but trying to summarize. It says, what clues are there that God has had a purpose in Jesus' suffering all along? So we're trying to get a little bit beneath the surface with the participant and get them to think, well, what are the clues here that God had a purpose in Jesus' suffering? And again, it's connecting to that sense of, can we make sense of our suffering? But actually we're looking to Jesus' suffering to try to understand that. The last question, hopefully you can follow. It's a little bit unusually laid out, but we hope that you'll become used to it and it'll connect. And hopefully you're doing it with people who know nothing about Bible studies and they don't know the formats, so that this format will be very normal to them, hopefully after the first study with them. The next part, this story is full of references to the Old Testament as we read that scripture is being fulfilled. Isaiah 53 is the one Old Testament passage written hundreds of years before Jesus lived that speaks directly about the suffering of Jesus. See Isaiah 53, so that's where they could look at this panel. It's a quote with a couple of notes to try to explain some strange Bible words that we're all familiar with, which our participants may have never heard. So question 4, Isaiah says, God's servant suffered for our transgressions and iniquities. How do these words in Isaiah help to explain why Jesus suffered? So again, we're trying to think about why Jesus was suffering and get to that question of making sense of suffering, but in the light of Jesus' suffering. And then very finally, the respond to the story. 1, if Jesus suffered for our willful disobedience towards God, how might this move you to turn away from sin and seek forgiveness from God? We're here, as you know, we're at a later part of the gospel, so the later studies call for more of a response. We're hoping that people will have journeyed this far and that they'll have come to a point where they're wanting to perhaps consider taking a step of faith or thinking about turning away from sin and seeking forgiveness. We here have a quote from Lewis. It says, the suffering we experience is not always explained or clear. C.S. Lewis wrote, nor have I anything to offer my readers except my conviction that what pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge, a little human sympathy more than much courage, and the least tincture of the love of God more than all. So how does the loving sacrifice of Jesus bring meaning and hope to our lives, even in the darkness of suffering? So here we're trying to get to the answer that we were asking at the beginning, can we make sense of our suffering? Really, we're trying to focus the participant on thinking about the loving sacrifice of Jesus as being the answer to the darkness of suffering in our lives, that how we can have meaning and how we can have hope in our life, even if it's in the darkness of suffering. And then here, really, there's a call because we're towards the end. It's the last study in the gospel. Would you consider receiving this great love of God through faith in Jesus, the one who suffered for you? There'll be different questions which you may feel very comfortable asking your participant to respond to. There may be some in the respond that you'll just allow them to silently consider or to consider as you finish up the study. But we wanted to encourage people to ask the question, to make the participant think, would they themselves consider receiving this, which we're really saying is the answer in the midst of suffering, while it's not always clear or explained, that the hope of the cross is what brings sense in a suffering world. So that's really just a glimpse of one of the studies. We were excited with the design. So again, thanks to Patter. We'd be very excited to see how it's used, and hopefully people can use this resource to try to bring this great story of the Lord Jesus to answer some of these questions. So I think I'll leave it there. Maybe back to you, Peter, and I can answer a couple of questions.